This is a review of American Truck Simulator. Sort of. I'm more concerned with how the game makes me feel as opposed to how well it's designed or how it performs. And in order to talk about how this truck driving game makes me feel, I need to get into some abstract territory. As a driving metaphor, I've got to go off-road for a while before I can find the way back home. It's going to be a lot, is what I'm saying. The unscripted translation there is, it's going to be a lot. I'm going to delve into some areas that I think are kind of interesting, but definitely abstract and a little bit more conceptual. So if that sounds cool, come along for the ride. I don't feel like there's been enough philosophical attention paid to the car or vehicles in general, but specifically the consumer-grade car. It seems clear that cars can have meaning and significance well beyond their physical specs and surface-level functions, but I've had a hard time finding any serious writing on the subject. One notable exception is the excellent YouTube channel Regular Car Reviews, which uses literary analysis and a very stereotypically American sense of sentimentality to talk about the significance of specific cars or cars in general and how they can impact our lives. Great stuff, go check it out. Also, a while back I found this really fantastic book called Carjacked by Ann Lutz Fernandez and the anthropologist Catherine Lutz. It's a very objective and sort of level-headed view of car culture, specifically in the US, and how vehicle manufacturers market their products, as well as how cars are sold at the dealership level and the often devastating financial impact of owning or even just leasing a car. As far as how this book discusses that almost religious reverence that some people have for their cars or cars in general, it definitely addresses the many ways that brands market their cars and how some of these marketing methods and ideas essentially sustain themselves via the consumers. They become ingrained after a while. For example, Matchbox cars and RC cars do an excellent job of imprinting on young boys especially that cars are cool and desirable and that your favorite car says something about who you are as a person. Similarly, dealerships and brands really like to promote relatively frequent upgrades, even if your practical gains of each upgrade are going to be minimal, such as moving from a 2016 model to a 2018 model of the same car. In step with this sales technique is the prevalence of individual ambitions with regards to cars. Plenty of typical car owners, as well as enthusiasts, have their current car, that's one thing, but also off in the distance somewhere is their holy grail car, the one that they really want but probably should never buy because it's bound to be very expensive and impractical. Even the idea of buying a specific car based on how well it matches your personality and identity is the result of decades of the same marketing tactic. First, you establish which demographic each car is for, quote unquote, and after a while, the design elements that separate each major car personality category become normalized. Carjacked provides some really excellent examples of this in action. Quote, in a 2004 survey, 46% of Americans agreed with the notion that their car reflected their personality. One 30-something woman from Long Island explained that her Volkswagen Passat mirrored her informal personality. The Passat, a car with an image that is adult but still youthful, seemed to this woman to be just the right fit. One BMW owner in his 30s goes even further in his identification. What I have with my car is definitely a relationship. It's definitely a part of me, part of my personality. When my car is in the shop, I feel an emptiness inside. I'm not here to combat decades and decades of marketing and the subsequent effects, despite the ethical questionability of these tactics. Fact is, cars are recognized both from academic and experiential standpoints as having value and meaning beyond their physical attributes. And this is where I can make things a little more personal, at least for a bit. I definitely get into a specific headspace when driving a car, something that I'll be referring to here as the driving headspace or just the in-car headspace. And I think this headspace is largely influenced by the strange combination of place and non-place that's inherent to driving. So this is a very basic breakdown of the idea, and I'm not an expert, but non-place is this interesting concept that basically refers to spaces of anonymity and transience. place, such as a parking lot or like an airport hallway or definitely a highway, which we'll get to later. But I would also argue that the collection of places you pass by while driving through a town or another populated area become a non-place from the perspective of the driver. But at the same time, the interior of a vehicle is a place, meaning that the driver inhabits both place and non-place while driving. This weird combination isn't that common in daily life. In most cases, you're either in a place or a non-place at any given moment. And I think the combination of the two contributes to the in-car headspace that I've been talking about here. As an example, just think how easy it is to space out and get lost in your thoughts when staring out the window of a bus. On top of this combo of place and non-place, there's also a unique sense of isolation. I'm alone in my car, listening to music, but I'm also not alone because I'm literally surrounded by dozens of other people, most of whom are alone in their own cars. That book, Carjacked, comments on how driving a car can even cause internal changes to the driver, with some seeing it as an escape from their home or work life, while others feel like they're trapped and just want to arrive at their destination as soon as possible. These changes can even lead to road rage. As plenty of people have pointed out before, you treat other people very differently when you're in a car compared to when you're just walking around or you happen to be in a building with others. So, any kind of altered headspace that someone experiences in a car isn't inherently good or bad, and there's a lot of variation based on each person, their life circumstances, and even just the car that they're driving. For example, you've probably noticed how certain drivers in sports cars or supercars can sometimes be less obedient when it comes to courtesy and the rules of the road. But most importantly, I wanted to bring up the altered driving headspace concept so that I can talk about what it feels like when I play American Truck Simulator. So let's gather up some of the most important factors that influence the car driving headspace. And these are just the factors that I've personally identified. Feel free to disagree with any of them. So we have the driver, the vehicle itself, the cultural ideology surrounding the car or vehicles in general, and something that's very important for this discussion, the surrounding environment. And that brings us back to place and non-place. When I'm driving around from day to day, I'm moving through different locations within a city. That collection of locations actually has a big impact on my driving headspace. Seeing active locations while driving will engage my brain in some small way, maybe just on the level of reading store signs or taking a look at the people on the sidewalk. I'm passing real places, but they only stay relevant for a few seconds. This process applies to just about every city, town, residential area, and even parks and natural spaces. But what happens to the driving headspace when the locations are only notable for being incredibly nondescript? Well, that's right. It's time to talk about highways. Yeah. Alright, so highways are really interesting to me. In fact, I think that in an age of hyperstimulation, anything that's seen as inherently boring is really ripe for analysis and study. So highways, specifically in the US, are pretty boring, and in terms of looks, they range from meh to downright ugly. In fact, the only highways that I would call pretty only earn that label because of the natural elements that surround them. It's not about the highway itself. Highways are also a relatively recent addition to modern society, with the first American highway being completed in 1911 and widespread highway construction being initiated in the mid-1950s, specifically the interstate system. Obviously, the car itself was the inspiration for highways. The more popular and ubiquitous the car became, the greater the need for large-scale, high-efficiency roadways. In the US, highways made long-distance travel and trucking possible, and it's not surprising that the 1960s and 70s saw a whole bunch of road movies. And if you want further evidence that highways are important to American life, check out this excellent quote from the Federal Highway Administration. The interstate system has been a part of our culture as construction projects, as transportation in our daily lives, and as an integral part of the American way of life. Every citizen has been touched by it, if not directly as motorists, then indirectly, because every item we buy has been on the interstate system at some point. So that touches on the historic significance of highways, but the experience of of actually being on a highway is pretty interesting too. As I already said, they don't look great, and they're not supposed to. They are utilitarian in nature. Highways are the result of engineering and construction, two disciplines that are not especially well known for their artistry and finesse. There are elements of the natural world on display, but much more noticeable by design are man-made road signs, advertisements, and distant views of towns and cities that are only an exit away. One of the most striking differences of driving on a highway versus driving in a populated area is the increased sense of isolation. The driving headspace isolation I already talked about comes from the driver's immediate surroundings, meaning the car itself, the very tiny space that your body happens to be occupying. Active locations outside of the car kind of work against that isolation, even if only in small ways. But out on a highway, it's a very different story. Your larger, wider surroundings are now also contributing to that sense of isolation, at least when the highway isn't completely backed up with traffic, which are conditions that consequently American Truck Simulator almost never presents to the player. In that game, and in my personal highway driving experience, most times you're just out there on your own with the occasional passing car or right lane slowpoke. And when you're driving on the highway at night, the sense of isolation is even further amplified. And in fact, many American filmmakers have used this specific imagery to create a tone of isolation, loneliness, or even fear. So with all that said, what kind of headspace did American Truck Simulator create for me, and how did it make me feel when I was playing the game? So I got American Truck Simulator for $5, and I probably wouldn't have bought it at full price. I really didn't have high expectations for the game. I had seen the Polygon overview of the game years ago, and I tried the demo for Euro Truck Simulator 2 a few weeks earlier, but that's it. I also recently finished a budget PC build, which opened up my game library to some slightly more advanced Steam listings, and during my first 3 days with the game, I put in about 14 hours. I was very much hooked. And I have to admit that part of why I got sucked in was the gamey aspects. Driving time is condensed, so you can finish the average job pretty quickly, and with your new earnings, you might want to upgrade your company headquarters or buy a new truck. And if you're tired of grinding, you can take out a very low interest loan. Meanwhile, the quick job mode lets you try out a bunch of different trucks, discover new dealerships, service centers, and recruitment agencies. The gameplay is also fairly straightforward, and even if you get your truck jammed up in a parking lot, all you need to do is load an autosave and keep your distance from tricky environments like that in the future. Realistically, I don't think that I'll be playing this game all that often once the novelty wears off. I just have a lot of other stuff to play and a lot of other stuff that I could be doing with my time, like making extremely popular YouTube videos. But once I'm in American Truck Simulator, it's very easy to stick around and take job after job. Above all else, it's about that driving headspace. I would describe it as genuinely meditative. In fact, it's a classic meditation technique to engage your attention in a very minor way, because if you're focusing on just your breathing, for example, then you won't be thinking about typical sources of stress and anxiety. For the majority of an in-game assignment, all you really need to do is watch where you're going and not crash the truck. You have the option to add restrictions and challenge elements, but you're not required to do any of it. At least the way I play, this is more like a road trip simulator, and as happens to me on road trips in real life pretty frequently, it becomes very easy to forget where I am and where I'm going. For a few moments at a time, I can be surrounded by perfectly familiar environments, just trees or deserts or an empty stretch of highway, and still feel like I'm nowhere, just by myself in the middle of the night with some Hank Williams music playing and the reassuring sound of the turn signal control snapping back into place. Sometimes there's rain, and sometimes the engine sounds like the box fan that helps you fall asleep in the summer. And that's it. It's not exactly escapism, because this place that you're escaping to in the game is unremarkable and mundane. In the real world, you could very easily go to this place, but maybe it's this unremarkable quality that ends up making it special. A while ago, I made a video about the game Littlewood and the appeal of life sim games, and I've been tempted to compare American Truck Simulator to that genre because on a surface level, it is a life sim game of sorts. But so much of what I identified as the appeal of life sim games was about participating in some kind of roleplay. In Stardew, you roleplay as an amateur farmer. In Littlewood, you roleplay as a farmer and a mayor and a town planner. In Animal Crossing, you roleplay as just a really boring person who's obsessed with the accumulation of wealth and possessions. And yes, in American Truck Simulator, you can technically roleplay as a trucker who also owns their own trucking company, but instead I use it to roleplay as myself. That's kind of abstract. I'll try to put it another way. A lot of life sim games stimulate my creativity only in reference to the game world. They inspire a lot of ideas in my mind, but those ideas are only relevant to each game environment. In American Truck Simulator, on the other hand, my mind feels stimulated, but that's because of a lack of input from the game. It gives me plenty of room to be who I already am. The game design rulebook, as well as the game criticism rulebook, say that immersion is good. So how can a game that lets my mind constantly wander away from the task at hand also be good? When it comes to immersion and themes, something like Doom or God of War feels opaque, whereas American Truck Simulator is translucent. In fact, let's go ahead and illustrate that point visually. Over here, this is most games. All you see is the game itself. You're invested in the world, the story, and the action. As a result, you blend your own identity with the identity of the player character. You lose yourself in the experience. But here's American Truck Simulator, representing a different kind of game that doesn't feel quite as engrossing. In fact, depending on the type of screen that you're watching this video on, you might be able to see bits of your real-world environment, or maybe even your own reflection. As far as I'm concerned, a game letting me be me is special. I'm not trying to make the argument that American Truck Simulator is a masterpiece, or that everyone should play it, but it does offer me a unique opportunity that I don't come across in games very often. Although, as a side note, I did recently find a game that strikes a very similar chord, and I'd like to talk about that one later on. But for now, I hope that this has been a somewhat distinctive discussion about what has become one of my favorite truck driving video games. I mean, it's at least in the top 10. Okay, top 20. Thanks for watching. Feel free to take a look at some of my other videos. I also put links to some of my other work in the description section of videos, so if you're dedicated enough to stick around to the end, maybe take a look-see down there. And that's all. Thanks for stopping by.